You, ladies and gentlemen. Can everyone hear me okay? Have I got my microphone placed properly? Good. The only certitude about that day in 1990 was that Captain Caviatus was going to be flying the airplane and Flight Officer Klotz was going to be his co pilot. As they left Medellin, Colombia, on their way to New York John Kennedy Airport, there was one other thing that we might want to consider, and that is that the air traffic controllers in New York City are probably going to give them a bad time. This information I'm sharing with you was taken from a book called Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell. Malcolm Gladwell penned this book in an effort to study success. So, in a book to study success, you'd be surprised that he talks about airplane crashes. But at the end of this talk, you'll see how that relates to success. This flight 052, Avianca, on the way to Kennedy Airport, before they even took off, they had to delay the flight and fly around for 20 minutes before they could take off, before they could leave Medellin. Delayed flying is one of the things that occurs in airplane crashes. As they continued to fly, they got over Virginia and they got delayed again. So now they're going into New York, the Kennedy Airport, and they run into a pocket of stormy weather. It is this where our story begins. Now, as I said, those traffic controllers in New York City, they end up selling pilots on doing whatever it is that they want. The traffic controllers in New York City, they think that they're in charge of the skies, and they speak to those pilots as though they are children. Now, if you are a person like First Officer Klotz from a country of low PDA, rather high PDA like Colombia, that could be a devastating effect for you. PDA is an abbreviation for Power Distance Index. Now, did you know that people's tendency to use mitigation speech, that is to modify what they're saying or sugarcoat what they're saying, is related to the country that they're coming from? Now, you may think that that's a bit ethnic unflattering, or it could be racist or what have you, but this airline, Avianca, had so many crashes over a certain period of time, they enrolled a guy named Hofstadter to do some studies. What Hofstadter found is that in the cockpit, the pilot is in charge. The pilot is like God, kind of like a doctor in the emergency room, right? Kind of like an attorney in the courtroom, right? Or even, if you will, like a DTM in Toastmasters. And believe it or not, when people are talking to doctors, when they're talking to pilots, when they're talking to DTMs, particularly when they are evaluating DTMs, they tend to mitigate what they're saying. And they're mitigated for a number of reasons, but I think chief of which is they want to get what they want. So as they concluded the study, they came up with this concept called Power Distance Index. This Power Distance Index, if a country has a low Power Distance Index, then you don't get that much mitigation. If a country has a high Power Distance Index, then you get a whole lot of it. Meanwhile, back to our flight getting ready to land into Kennedy. As I told you, they had to circle around the airport more than one time, more than one airport. And what happens in that particular case is that your fuel runs low. And without fuel, you can't fly an airplane. Unfortunately for Klotz, as he approaches Kennedy Airport, he gets an air traffic controller to tell him basically that he can't land now. They had already made one approach and couldn't make it, so they had to make a second approach, which even lessens the fuel even more. Klotz, in response to his captain who told him, "Tell them we're in an emergency." Well, Klotz kind of sort of told them that they were in an emergency, but he never mentioned the word emergency, and he kind of said as an aside, and we're low on fuel. Now, Klotz had good reason to be intimidated because there's a story about a New York air traffic controller who was talking to a guy who needed to land. He didn't have a lot of time messing around, and she was getting frustrated because of the situation that they were in. And she said to him, "Listen, just stay right where you are. Don't move. I'll be right back." And so here he is in his airplane, sitting there. After a few minutes of this, he goes, "Madam, was I married to you in a former life?" Well, eventually, he got over that and he was able to land his plane. So the sad part about it is that flight 0502, it crashed, and the last thing that they heard on the flight recorder on the box was the air traffic controller saying to Klotz, "Do you have enough gas to make it in?" And that was the last thing that they heard. So what is mitigating speech and salesmanship? How does that affect us as Toastmasters? In Toastmaster, you may have the occasion to do an evaluation on someone who wants to be a great speaker. You might have the occasion to evaluate someone who you think is already a great speaker, but they're wanting to be a better speaker. And because of your apprehension, you may not tell them the truth. You may find yourself mitigating your comments because you don't want to offend them and you know they've been around a long time. I want to encourage you to make mitigation of speech a thing of the past. I want to encourage you to think of it in terms of how much you're helping someone by telling them the truth. And for those of you who are accomplished speakers, for those of you who know that people mitigate their comments for you, I want to encourage you to do like some of the pilots do. A pilot understanding this power distance index thing, he might say to the people in the cockpit, you know, I don't fly very much. I only fly a couple of times a month. So if you see me doing something stupid, please tell me. So that kind of helps them tell the truth. That kind of helps them point out mistakes. Because see, they have found that in cases of flight crashes, the most of the flights that crash is when the most experienced pilot is flying the plane. And that's kind of well, you wouldn't expect it to be that way because he's the best flyer. But the thing about the experienced flyer, he got no problems telling the inexperienced flyer, "Guy, you messing up." So let's eliminate mitigation and let's move forward, onward, and upward. Mr. Toastmaster.